afternoon. My name is Kenneth Lee. I'm a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and I'm honored to moderate this final showcase panel, the Law, Science, and Public Policy. Before we begin, I want to thank Dean, Julie, Evelyn, and all the others who've helped arrange this conference. I know it takes a lot of time and effort to make this happen, and we appreciate it. Also want to thank all the people here, the audience here today, because this is the last session on the last day of the conference. I know you guys are probably tired, and judging from the activity at the hotel bar, some of you may be nursing a hangover as well, but you made it, so thank you for being here. I think today's topic is a very timely one. I think over the past couple of years, we've heard the buzzword or buzz phrase, follow the science. We've seen bumper stickers or internet memes saying, I trust science. And some scientists today are like celebrities. They're famous, people respect them, and you see them all over the TV and magazines. And for those of you who read that intellectual journal, Us Weekly, you may be familiar with a section called, Celebrities, They're Just Like Us. And they show a photo of, like Tom Cruise walking his dog, or Sean Penn buying a cup of coffee before he punches someone in the face for taking a picture of them. And I think scientists, like celebrities, are just like us in some ways. We respect them, but they're not infallible. They may have their own biases, and they may be subject to pressure. That being said, I think everyone agrees that science needs to play an important role in in crafting public policy. Today's session, we will discuss, how can we ensure that science plays an appropriate and proper role in crafting public policy. And we have an eclectic and all-star panel to discuss this issue. First, to my right is Professor Stephen Benner. He is a serial entrepreneur in biotechnology. He served as a professor of chemistry at Harvard. I think his tie might be of the periodic chart, I believe. If you can't see that. He's been also at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and the University of Florida. Today, he directs a biotech company managing the current pandemic, and he also presides over a nonprofit called Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution. As a government major in college, I have no idea what that means. I suspect most of you also have no idea what that means. And if you did understand what that means, you're probably at the wrong hotel. I think the Federation of American Scientists are meeting at the Hyatt across the street. But we're happy to have Professor Benner here today. We also have Professor Glenn Cohen right here of Harvard Law School. I believe he was one of the youngest professors hired and then to get tenure at Harvard Law School. And since then, he is now the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law, Deputy Dean, and Faculty Director, and the Petrie Flom Center for Health, Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard. All very impressive. When I was 9 or 10, I think I was collecting XP points playing Dungeons & Dragons. I think Professor Cohen at that age was obtaining prestigious titles and chairs at Harvard. So, again, very impressive. He is one of the leading scholars in bioethics, health information technology, mobile health, and various other issues. And we're happy to have him here. Finally, we have Christina Sandifer. She is the Executive Vice President at the Goldwater Institute. She is the co-drafter of the Right to Try initiative, which is now federal law, which protects terminally ill patients the right to try safe investigational treatments that have been prescribed by their physicians but are not yet FDA approved. Her most recent book is called Cornerstone of Liberty, Private Property Rights in 21st Century America. We were supposed to have Professor Hank Greeley of Stanford. Unfortunately, I think he had a knee injury and could not be here. We hope that he recovers quickly, because I think Miami Dolphins may need him as their quarterback next week. Before we begin, I was reminded to tell everyone that if you're seeking CLE credits, you're required to sign in each day to receive the credit. If you haven't done so already, use the QR code on the CLE card provided. If you don't have that card, you can go outside and volunteers will have that card, and you can use the QR code to get your CLE credit. The format for this is each panelist will provide an opening statement for 6 or 7 minutes, and after that I think they'll respond to each other's points, and then we will open it to the floor. We want this to be very interactive, and I think this will be very informative and fun. And I think Professor Benner will start.
So is the microphone on? Yes, it is. Well, as Judge Lee pointed out, I am a high priest of the new religion called science, and now that you know this, you are all obligated to trust me, otherwise you will be deplatformed, shunned, and perhaps even unemployed. This topic today I'm looking at as an experiment because I was curious to see how the legal profession, which I gather is represented in the room here, this is a group I don't usually talk with, but how the legal profession would respond to an admission by a scientist, a frank admission by a scientist like myself, that in many areas, from climate to COVID, the scientists do not publicly offer our best good faith assessments of reality when it comes to policy, and more on that in a minute. As many of you know, ever since about the Second World War, there has been a covenant between the body politic and scientists where the politic supports us with very little control, except perhaps by peer review done by the scientists themselves, but in return expect to have basic research breakthroughs that eventually lead to useful things, like the atomic bomb, or for that matter, environmental sound policies or medicines. And of course, that covenant has been wildly successful, but in public policy, the covenant really relies on the willingness of scientists, when asked, to give what we think to be our best good faith representations of reality, perhaps with caveats. And that part of the covenant has, over the last couple of decades, been largely destroyed. So climate science, of course, offers the best example, the best documented case, but COVID really exemplifies how the corruption of science costs lives. And I'm going to have a few words to say about this, but let me give you a couple of examples. There are propositions that people who have reason to know, have an opinion on, have the opinion that these propositions are true, but they cannot say them in public for fear of being deplatformed, shunned, or unemployed. So, for example, in climate science, this is not the warmest year on record, not even close. That's generally accepted to be true, but it's something that we can't say in public. There are the rise in global temperature that so concerns Al Gore or Greta Thunberg actually started in 1750 and was 2/3 over before carbon dioxide from human sources became a factor at all. Again, everybody who has a reason to have an opinion on this subject knows that that's likely to be true, but we can't say it. The Paris Accords, by the way, they're innumerate. There is absolutely no reason to believe that they will have any impact at all on sea level or any of the other things. Those are all true statements. And anyone who has reason to have an opinion accepts these propositions, yet if they say them in public, they risk deplatforming, shunning, and unemployment. And so politicians, even politicians on the right, this is not a left-right thing, Boris Johnson, a conservative from the United Kingdom, Erin O'Toole, the conservative from Canada, all adopt policies in climate that have absolutely no basis in science at all. And that's because of the way in which information has been transferred. But COVID is really the case, and it's a timely case, where the goring of science has caused deaths, okay? Everyone in the position to have an opinion at all knows that first, COVID-19 was likely the product of human engineering. Second, that it was likely circulating in the United States before the first cases were identified in the United States, and that the CDC and the Food and Drug Administration forced public health surveillance to be blind in the first 3 months of this pandemic. And so let me amplify on that last point. I mean, in my lab, we were aware of COVID. We had COVID assays running in February 1st. We knew about COVID because we had participated in the SARS scare in 2003, 2004. But the Center for Disease Control required that all COVID tests be done in Atlanta, and I have no idea what their legal authority was for requiring that, but they were scientists, and therefore they were trusted and obeyed. And then the Center for Disease Control set up CDC-approved centers around the United States and distributed a CDC-approved test kit. That kit did not work. This is a political advertisement because it did not employ our chemistry. So our chemistry was available to secure our campus in March. It received regulatory approval in April in India, not in the United States. We did not get a regulatory approval in the United States until August. And just last week, Rochelle Walensky at the CDC said, and I'm quoting now, masks can help reduce your chance of COVID infections by more than 80%. And that's a statement with absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever. I don't even know what that statement means. But it has been, even today, you can go outside. The Mayflower will tell you that they are enforcing CDC recommendations. Right? If they were in any other field, not scientists, you would not regard them as scientists or authoritative. You might regard them as, having been failed bozos, probably, outside of the field. But such is the trust that you folks give to scientists, and so I'm interested to see what you folks have to say about that.
Thank you very much. I'm sure my learned friend and I will have a lot to talk about during the Q&A, but I think I will start with my own remarks, which is just to say I was absolutely delighted but somewhat surprised to get to address you today when Dean sent me the email. Why? Because I think of myself as a little bit of an outsider, a little bit of a gadfly, a little bit of a provocateur, and you will tell me whether I have provoked you well enough by the end of these remarks. So I would describe myself as a classical liberal who leans left but has libertarian priors on a lot of things. And when I look at the thought leaders aligned with FedSoc in my areas, bioethics and health law, I see a really interesting terrain. I see a place where your big tent of libertarian and non-libertarian conservatism has more fractures than elsewhere in your program, and that's what I want to explore today. In particular, to examine the ways in which some of the libertarian parts of your movement have, in my view, trimmed their sails in this space in a way that might be otherwise if they didn't have the other half of the movement with them. So I want to start with some of the major court battles and victories for libertarianism in bioethics and health law in the 2000s. I think if you look at the cases since 2000, you'd see that there's at least 3 cases that are worth talking about, 2 quite important, 1 maybe less important. Interestingly, all 3 were circuit court decisions, not U.S. Supreme Court decisions. The first is Abigail Alliance, which set the stage for the right to try legislation. My learned friend from the Goldwater Institute has worked on and pioneered. And this case involved an alliance of families who had children or other members with terminal illnesses, who argued that there was a substantive due process right to access drugs that had cleared phase 1 testing at FDA, but had not yet been proven safe and effective under the FDA scheme. Full disclosure, I helped handle the government's successful petition for rehearing in this case en banc as a Bush II appellate attorney at the DOJ. We ultimately won and had a declaration there is no such constitutional right. I was working with now Judge Greg Katsas, one of the finest lawyers I've ever worked with, on this case. But what was so interesting about this case, it was that there was a libertarian push against the Bush DOJ, against the Bush FDA, and that they chose to clothe the arguments in the garb of substantive due process. Certainly not a favorite of many people who are part of the movement. We see echoes of this case now even today in debates about ivermectin use, for example. Should we be free to make any therapeutic use we want to? Freedom of therapeutic choice. And there's a great new book on this topic about the history of it by Louis Grossman, who's a law professor historian. Several years after the loss, the campaigns began first at the state level, then at the congressional level for legislation that would protect the right to try. And my learned friend and I may have some differences about how much FDA was already doing in that space and what was needed and what the change is. But I want to just crystallize this as a moment of a really clear vision about what a libertarian movement as to FDA would look like. It was cemented by a second case, the Coronia case in the Second Circuit, which is a decision restricting FDA's ability to prescribe off-label promotion of several drugs, not clothed in substantive due process, but the First Amendment. Again, a Second Circuit decision, never taken to the U.S. Supreme Court because FDA, I believe, I was out of the Justice Department by this point, correctly determined that going to the Supreme Court would make things worse for them, given the then composition of the court, and even now, I would say even more bad for them in terms of the First Amendment takes of the Supreme Court. The third case, which is one probably very few people have heard about, is a case called Flynn from the Ninth Circuit, which held that the National Organ Transplant Act, which prohibits the sale of organs and other bodily substances, not all of them, but some of them, would not apply to bone marrow being sold when it was derived from apheresis rather than aspiration. Now, some people might throw NFIB v. Sebelius and the attack on the mandate as a fourth case in this kind of area. I would push back because, as I often remind people, nobody argued there that it violated the rights of Americans to have a mandate. The argument was instead that it violated for the federal government to have a mandate. Romney Care in Massachusetts and its mandate continues to apply, and it was a question there of federalism. Okay, so these cases, I think, though, have a core to them that is a coherent libertarian argument about how we should think about this area of law. What would it mean to extend those principles to other areas of law? Here are some ideas. One space would be abortion. It's no accident that the idea of my body, my choice is now being co-opted as a phrase in the anti-vax movement, right? It's a natural place for libertarians to be, to push about the decision to control our bodies. And it would be a natural thing to view a coalition of libertarians and left-leaning individuals to view something like SB 8 as repulsive. Now, you might say this is quite different because of a million limit on libertarianism as to swinging one's fist in another's face. And we can talk about whether that's the best way to think about the fetal case. But if that's your principle, then I think some of the opposition to vaccination mandates becomes more difficult. All right, I'm not an idiot. I don't think you're going to explode the Republican Party and end all electoral success by taking this principle and extending it to abortion. So I'm not going to suggest to you that this is a likely future for the libertarian legal movement. But there are more plausible, in my view, frontiers that might be conquered where libertarians who are in this room might find common ground with many others. One of these is extending the idea of a right to try to psilocybin and other psychedelics, which have been shown to have some therapeutic benefits, and we have these trials going on right now, or cannabis. It's not hard to see why the same attacks being made on FDA's authority to control therapeutic choice should not extend to the Controlled Substances Act and the idea of drug scheduling. And psilocybin is a particularly interesting case because there's a long history of psychedelics being used for spiritual practices. So this is a place where there may even be overlap between those who want to bring back spiritual life in America and those who want to push a libertarian ideal. We can keep going. What about safe injection sites? An outstanding place to take people who want to inject drugs and people who want to protect them and reduce their harm, and the government should stay out of the way of these kinds of activities. The decriminalization of sex work, willing workers and willing people who are consumers. Not to mention the right to die, for example, a place where we could really see a libertarian movement pushing things. Turning to reproductive technologies, we have things like mitochondrial replacement therapies and gene editing, both currently prohibited in this country by the Aderholt rider that Congress passed first under President Obama, that have been renewed every year, is a place where libertarian legal movements might make a real difference in changing our policy. Unlike fetuses, the arguments about harm to others are much more strained in this context, where the existence of these technologies determines who comes into existence or whether people come into existence, rather than pushing back. There are other areas that I think are really fascinating as case studies. One of those would be responsibility for health. The question about whether libertarians should tell people they have to be responsible for their own health. Of course, this was the germ behind the mandate idea in Romney Care, initially championed as a health policy in conservative legal circles. It became the absolute enemy during the NFIB versus Sebelius kinds of arguments. Then, when we got back to work requirements for Medicaid, right? Again, this idea of responsibility for health and taking responsibility became back in vogue. And now it's kind of a little bit on the outs again when we're talking about responsibility in terms of vaccination and risk reduction. This, I think, would be a very interesting thing to talk about during the Q&A about whether we think the luck egalitarian impulses behind these arguments are worthwhile or not. So if I'm right that these are all positions libertarians should be thinking about, is it merely the political disadvantage of upsetting the existing structure, the modus vivendi, that stops us from having these conversations? Is it pragmatism? Or is there instead justified principled arguments as to why the libertarian side of the legal movement has chosen the targets it has thus far and left others as red-headed stepchildren? I'm looking forward to discussing this with my august friends.
All right. Well, I usually say that I am the token libertarian on the panel and happy to play cleanup duty on that, but it actually sounds like Professor Cohen and I don't disagree on all that much. So that's always fun. But I do want to focus on a slightly different version of this topic. I want to talk about why we must choose, at least in the context of law and government, individual autonomy over science-based paternalism, for lack of a better term. And I will focus mostly on medical autonomy and the medical side of things, at least in my initial remarks. So first, medical autonomy is not only, in my opinion, a cornerstone of medical ethics, it is one of the most basic ideas of freedom guaranteed by our Constitution. And if you think about it, if you own yourself, which is what our governing system says, at least in theory in the United States, if one owns oneself, then they have to have the freedom to make these personal, intimate decisions, or otherwise you do not have the freedom to exercise any of your other rights. And there actually is a long line of cases that supports, to some degree, medical autonomy. So we've got cases from the Supreme Court that recognize one's right to refuse life-saving treatment. We have cases recognizing one's right to refuse unwanted bodily intrusions, one's right to care for one's own health in person and seek out the doctor of their choice, and on and on. Now, of course, a lot of these cases are limited to their facts and don't go very far beyond that. But some of the lower courts have even gotten into some really interesting issues. For example, the right to choose whether or not to cut your own hair. So we have a long line of tradition in the courts supporting the right to medical autonomy to some degree. But unfortunately, we also have a growing tradition both in what is accepted in governing and also what the courts have then accepted from government. And that is a system that prioritizes the preferences of public policy decision makers or even scientists vis-a-vis public policy decision makers at the expense of every person's right really to shape their own destiny. And that Moreover, questions about how we choose to live our lives, those, to a degree, really aren't scientific or medical questions at all. And that's where I think there's a lot of confusion when we have discussions like this and we talk about following the science. Science answers questions about reality, but it doesn't answer questions about how people should deal with this reality. And scientific experts may be experts in their field, but they aren't experts on people's individual values or risk tolerances. So, for example, in the case of medicine, whether a drug is acceptably risky for a particular person to take, that isn't a scientific judgment, that's not a medical judgment. Instead, that's a normative judgment that's going to vary from person to person depending on their circumstances, their risk tolerance, the benefits that they expect to derive from taking that treatment. And that's why government officials can't just follow the science, so to speak. There's many qualifications to that for that very reason, because they can't effectively determine what risks or benefits are applied to a particular population as a whole. So what we get is decisions that, in my opinion, end up being very disjointed, very arbitrary. So we have a system of medicine, and this is just broadly speaking, that on one hand allows folks to take dangerous medicines that I don't think anyone would argue are not dangerous, so something like chemotherapy, which is essentially poison, even acetaminophen, Tylenol, right? That kills hundreds of people a year. So we have a system that allows people to take those risks. We have a system that allows people to end their lives, at least in some states, with a doctor's help. And we even allow people to be paid, healthy people, to be paid to volunteer to test medicines whose risks we have no idea, that could be very dangerous and even fatal to them. But yet, in many cases, that same system also forbids people from taking treatments that could alleviate suffering or even help save their lives. And so it's very arbitrary, very disjointed. And nobody has perfect information. And that's another thing I think to remember when we talk about following the science, because you can have multiple people claiming that they're following the science and coming to very different conclusions. And if you backtrack, it may not be the logic that's the problem. It may be that the premises actually differ. Where there are unknowns, again, the principles of medical autonomy dictate that we have to defer to the risk tolerance of the individual. No system is going to insure against all risks, including our current system. Many, many treatments that are approved for safety and efficacy by the FDA are later pulled, are later retested. Just because something gets the stamp of approval from our federal government does not mean it's going to be right for every individual, does not mean that it comes without risks. It's impossible to insure against all risks. So again, the question comes down to who decides whether the level of risk is going to be acceptable to a patient. Is it the government or is it the patient herself? I think the question of information and allowing for the free flow of scientific information is a separate but also important one. The Coronia decision came up. I think that I have a different take on the outcome on how the FDA has interpreted the outcome of the Coronia decision. But I think this is a very, very important area to pay attention to, because censoring or withholding scientific information doesn't just hurt patients or consumers, it also violates constitutional rights to free speech. And in the context of medicine, this is particularly important because we not only have a government that is actually blocking patients from making certain decisions about treatments, but also taking away the tools, in my opinion, that patients and doctors need to be able to make those well-informed decisions. And that's what is so frightening, especially in an era where we have more access to more information than ever before. Some, of course, very helpful, some, of course, very unhelpful. And we have people who can pick and choose what information gets to patients and doctors. So in the context of off-label treatment and the discussion of that, that's what the Coronia decision dealt with. And there is this anomaly in law. Again, if you look at things from a free speech perspective, that says that off-label treatments or treatments that are for purposes or patients or dosages different than the federal government has approved, those treatments are legal, prescribing them is legal, it's actually very common, but yet under certain circumstances, federal law prohibits manufacturing companies from talking about those off-label treatments or promoting them. And I consider this to be a gag rule. Again, I think it's very harmful to patients and doctors and insurance companies and the like. And there is this line of cases where the courts are consistently saying that you can't prosecute speech if the conduct is lawful, then the truthful speech about the conduct also must be lawful, because otherwise, you're flipping the First Amendment on its head. We don't typically see in the law a situation where we see that conduct is lawful, but speech about that conduct is unlawful. And in my opinion, the FDA has continued to ignore such rulings or distinguish them in ways that only lawyers could love, right? When the Coronia decision came out, the FDA said, okay, well, we're not really prosecuting speech. What we're doing is we're using speech as evidence of the crime of misbranding. Well, what is branding if not speech? That is really a distinction only a lawyer could love. But we can laugh about these things, but the real world reality is that we now have scientists or pharmaceutical companies or others who are terrified to bring up or to discuss information that could actually help people for fear of criminal prosecution. And the fear is real. I've written about a company called Vascular Solutions that had truthful communications about the lawful use of varicose vein treatments. And they were prosecuted for making that truthful speech. It took 5 years and $25 million of the company's money and time to be able to eventually clear themselves of any wrongdoing. And at the end of the day, what came out of that? What innovations were suppressed because of the time and money that was spent on that litigation when nobody actually did anything wrong? That is not listening to science. That is suppressing science. So there's a lot, obviously, that we've all spoken about. I really look forward to the Q&A and further discussion. I guess I would just say that my takeaway from this very broad topic is that there's too much focus on whether or not government is following the science. And I think that, that results in, rather than ensuring a free flow of scientific information so that people can make their own decisions, which is what our Constitution empowers us to do, we are moving toward government as the decision maker so long as they can justify their actions in terms of following the science. And I would posit that rather than asking what is the correct science or whether government's following the science, we should be focusing on narrowing the scope of government action itself, properly constraining it, and deferring to the individual when there are close cases. So thank you. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you for the very interesting and provocative views of all the panel members. I don't know if anyone wants to directly respond to any of the other panelists' thoughts. If anyone's itching to do that.
Maybe I'll start, which is I want to focus in on this question of off-label promotion, because I think this is very interesting. So I'm completely in agreement that we've ended up in a very weird space where FDA does not have the authority to prohibit off-label use of a drug. That is, once a drug has been found to be safe and effective for an approved indication, it may be prescribed for any other indication, whether it's safe or effective for that. But we've restricted the ability to promote those other indications. So I think that is, I completely agree with my colleague, that is a weird asymmetry. Now, whether the asymmetry ought to be solved by getting rid of the restrictions on off-label promotion or instead expanding the agency's ability to look at other indications, I think is an interesting conversation, because there's no reason to think the fact that one indication has evidence behind it gives you any reason to think another indication does. Maybe some evidence as to safety, but as to efficacy, the other indication could be very, very different. I don't know if we disagree on that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think we agree on the fact that there's an asymmetry there. I think just agreeing on whether that should be then, that the FDA should regulate more or regulate less is probably where the question lies. And I think it's important to think about why the FDA doesn't regulate or require the same kind of proof every time a prescription is prescribed off-label or medicine is prescribed off-label. And just imagine, I mean, we've all heard the statistics that it can take 10, 15 years, billions of dollars to bring a drug to market. Some of that is R&D that the company needs to do. A lot of that is, getting through the regulatory, the clinical trial process that the FDA has imposed. Now, imagine you do that, for one set of the population. You do that for adults, or you do that for adults with a certain disease, or you do that for one type of cancer. And now you get that drug to market. Now you've got to turn around. We know that a lot of cancers are different, but they respond very similarly to the same treatment. Doctors are experts in their fields. Pharmaceutical companies know from continued testing these things. Now imagine if you had to take that drug all the way back through that process, another, potentially 5-10 years, $500,000 million. It would make these drugs inaccessible and cost prohibitive for patients when there's no need to do that. And at the end of that process, you got to keep in mind, I'm not saying that the clinical trial process isn't helpful or important, but in some ways it's kind of an arbitrary, phase to meet. And at the end of that process, there's, again, no guarantee that that treatment is going to work for that particular individual with that particular kind of cancer. All of this is a little bit more of an art than a science in some ways. And so, again, I think at the end of the day, we have to think about what does this mean for the individual who is trying to alleviate suffering or, God forbid, trying to save his or her own life.
I find this conversation cute, adorable. Right? I mean, Western civilization post-Enlightenment has been based on the notion that we can develop a knowledge of the world around us doing a process that, among other things, involves self-doubt, a little bit of humility, and doesn't accede to authority. Now, I've just told you guys, I mean, obviously there are many historical examples. Lysenko comes to mind. Of course, Darwinian evolution, did a real number on political theory. I mean, leading to Margaret Sanger's eugenics all the way to, National Socialism, anti-Semitism. I've just told you, as an expert in two areas that are core public policy, right, that the science is corrupted and that you're descending into dark ages because you don't let scientists tell you about COVID or coronavirus, and you folks are adorably discussing what you are as your academic. I mean, I've read, Glenn has a very famous brief called the Lander Brief, which is involved in the myriad cases. One of his, I've read this. I went back and read, Christina, your amicus for the hallucinogenic drug case, and right, it's all fine, but the underpinnings of science, in fact, the underpinnings of nanny state, is that the nanny is going to be Mary Poppins, not Nanny McPhee, right? And the argument for libertarianism is not, it certainly is philosophical as you phrase it, but the ultimate argument is that the people who you give nanny power to are not capable of exercising it correctly. And so, I would not like to get into policy discussions today, but just give you my best good faith assessment of reality as a scientist, and that is that fewer people would have died of COVID in the United States had there been no FDA or CDC. And the reason, and it's a counterfactual, it's hard to prove, but the reason for that is because what would have happened without an FDA or CDC is that every veterinary school, every academic department of molecular biology would have had tests up and running when we did in the end of January, and we would have known what was going on in the public health sector much better than with the FDA standing in the way of that and the CDC screwing things up, because these people are not competent to be our nannies.
So I have a feeling we're both going to have some
don't usually play to the crowd.
Partial agreements and partial disagreements. So let's start with the partial agreement, right? If I was scoring the early months of the Trump CDC, would I give them 10 out of 10? Not even the Romanian judge would give them a 10 out of 10 on the scorecard, just to be clear. But the idea that without FDA we'd be better off, the requirements for vaccines to be approved, do you think most Americans would take a COVID vaccine? Do you think we would have investments in a COVID vaccine without an authority to review the data? Do you think if we just basically allowed people to sell vaccines without any scientific review thereof, or required individuals in the audience to make their own assessment, that we would have the level of vaccination we have had now, the level of investment we have had now in these vaccines? I don't think that's what you're saying, but that's kind of what you did say.
I'd be delighted to. Okay, again, I would prefer today not to talk about specific policies, but rather to give you my best good faith estimate about
but you said
truth
the
or
FDA,
falsity.
well, you say millions of people would be alive now if the FDA
I didn't
did
say
not
millions.
exist.
My best faith, good faith assessment of the reality is that fewer people would have died in America had there not been an FDA or a CDC. That's just a statement of a proposition. I'm asserting the truth value of it, right? Now, vaccines are a fascinating case, right? In 2008, the technology was invented which goes into the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. That's a remarkably rapid turnaround, 12 years to reality. I myself misunderstood. I was indeed expecting to have in 18 months to 24 months at the earliest for a vaccine to be developed. We had a lot of interactions with Newt Gingrich and various other people in the Trump administration with the diagnostics profile, but it appears as if the reason why the vaccine was so effectively and so rapidly delivered was because someone in the administration was pushing the FDA to stand down, to not go through all the whistles and bells. Now, you're asking a different question, which is a sociological question, which I'm not going to give you an opinion on, as to what the public response would have been different had there been less or more regulatory steps. But what's clear is it would have been later had there been more regulatory steps.
So I'm happy to let my learned friend jump in, but I just have to do one thing, because we're equivocating a little bit here. One is the question about whether the EUA pathway, the approval pathway, or the standards of approval for the vaccine were the right level, the wrong level, and you think perhaps they were too restrictive. It's quite different from saying there ought not to have been an FDA, there ought not to be a CDC, and America would have been better and fewer people would have died had those two institutions not existed.
Let me be
that
clear.
was what I understood your claim to be.
EUA for diagnostics, let's start there. Because the EUA came in diagnostics in large part in response to SARS, where finally somebody figured out that there was a risk of not having a diagnostics, right, which was sufficient in many circumstances. Now, what has happened with EUA is between 2003 and 2020 is that the EUA has become more and more like a regulatory process rather than a way of avoiding regulatory process. That's the same thing as right to try, right? There was a law and basically the right to try. A law has been eroded by regulatory
Sure. Yeah, and I think another interesting aspect of what you just said is the lack of focus on testing and approving testing rapidly. And, I can't speak to how many lives would have been saved had that not happened, but what I think is another important aspect of that is the snowball effect of what comes from that in other government regulations. So because we had a CDC and an FDA that were very slow to approve testing because we did not have state level or local level authority to be able to approve and administer testing, which is something that my colleagues at the Goldwater Institute have advocated for. It was very difficult for people to get tested. Therefore, it was very difficult to identify who actually had COVID and who did not. And so what is the response then from state governments, local governments, even the federal government? Well, it's to take the sledgehammer rather than the scalpel approach, right? And that's why we see lockdowns of various degrees. We need to just keep people away from each other. And since we don't know who has it and who doesn't, well, I guess we're just going to have to tell everybody that they have to stay home. And, the economic consequences, because we have to remember, too, this isn't just, healthcare doesn't just operate in a vacuum, and healthcare regulations don't operate in a vacuum. So the economic consequences of this, the mental health consequences, are astronomical, and we will spend decades trying to measure them. Yet, if we had a more permissive, a better system set up where people could have been tested better, we could have had an approach that might have focused more on, quarantining individuals. And I'm not suggesting that is the appropriate policy, but that would have been more of a scalpel approach, right? To allow other people to go about their business and to have certain people kind of kept away from the general public so that they don't get others sick. That is more of the historical type of response. And frankly, I think that would have allowed people to to continue living their lives and to go about, it would have had fewer economic consequences. So I think it's interesting to think about that aspect as well.
No, I mean, there's no question that this is true. But look, I mean, the FDA, for example, requires that a test that is patient-specific, where you're screening asymptomatic people, must be as sensitive as the most sensitive test. That's a holdover from HIV, because HIV people can be asymptomatic and still spread, and the test therefore has to be as sensitive. Of course, it makes absolutely no sense for a respiratory disease, because the respiratory disease is transferred by people who have a high viral load in their sneeze, not to be. And by the way, let me say for all the government majors here, I can get you all running HIV or COVID tests. I can get you running molecular COVID tests in about 30 minutes, all right? It's not difficult to do. Helen Chu was doing it in Seattle. She was told by the FDA to stand down. We were able to transfer our kids to some people in Colorado. My legal team told me, hey, don't do that unless you want to go to jail, because that's forbidden. What that did was force all tests to be false negatives, because the tests were not run. And that, of course, led to, I mean, we have a public space entry test. I have a test that will allow us to sample the COVID burden in this air. Not allowed to be used, okay? So the bottom line out of all this is, by the way, not millions, Glenn. We haven't had millions of deaths in the United States yet, but certainly, and I don't know the number, right? Somewhere in the tens of thousands would be my guess, but certainly it was quite true that for January, February, March, and April, we were blind as epidemiologists to what was going on out there because of the FDA, and I could have had every one of these people in the audience deputized to be running tests in their local community and doing a very good job of it.
Completely fair, but again, I want to be 100% clear on our point of disagreement and whether we are in fact in disagreement. One can say, since the history of the 1960s, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, the current shape of FDA, there are a million variations that have occurred: fast-track approval, accelerated approval, EUA, differences in choices about what kind of evidence you require and what kind of speed to get there you want. Technocratic, important decisions. We can disagree about the ways in which false positive, false negative were specified, sensitivity, specificity, size of the clinical trials, the correct thresholds. That is worlds apart from saying the world would have been better off if there was no governmental authority to review whether vaccines were safe and effective.
Okay.
So I don't think you disagree with that. Do you disagree with that?
No, but let's distinguish between diagnostics and things that you
Okay,
inject
so you
in
think
your
no
body.
FDA on diagnostics, but certainly an FDA on vaccines.
Let me also give you a scientific opinion that is, and everybody would agree with this, that safety and efficacy, as Christina has mentioned, are two very different things. And as a scientist, I cannot tell you what efficacy is in a medicine. A vaccine, I really can't tell you either, although it's easier because there is a metric for how many people vaccinated get sent to hospitals. But no, it's an interesting question. The question is, I must confess to my error in March of 2020, saying that it's going to be 2 years to get a vaccine. Why? Because Ebola had taken us 5 years, not quite the same pressure. Right? I understand, however, that my conservatism also has a risk, and that's the risk of the people dying in the time that it takes to go through the regulation. Now, my view is that if I believe that this is what's wrong with dealing with very intelligent people, right? I became a professor at Harvard, pretty good. I was the youngest tenured professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Professor Benner, I said to myself, you're pretty smart. No, the whole point about science is, of course, that we have to recognize that we're not that smart. And so my view is that I'm not capable of coming up with... I know I don't usually get applause in my talks. I mean, when I talk about, the dipole moment of nucleotide bases in DNA, no one seems to applaud. But yes, the point here is that you are in the situation where you're trying to make a decision between an early vaccine, which will kill people because it's not adequately tested, or a late vaccine where people will die because they don't have the vaccine. And I'm not smart enough to make that. And with Rochelle Walensky telling me that there's an 80% chance that masks will prevent me from getting COVID, I don't believe a thing she says anymore.
Sorry. How would each panel member grade the United States government's response to COVID, whether it means following the science or balancing science with other public policy considerations? And since we have a couple of academics, maybe we could grade it on a curve and take into account maybe what the rest of the world did. I think I know what your grade would be.
You've got that. Well, look, I mean, hydroxychloroquine. If you published a paper in the U.S. jurisdiction where it was not allowed to be in favor of it, you are 3.4 times more likely to come up with a negative result than if you published a paper outside of the U.S. jurisdiction. This is an analysis of metadata, and it's a statement that scientists changed what they published in response to political pressure. Right? It's better, we wish that Trump had kept his mouth shut, because we would have at least gotten a fair evaluation of that medication, which I happen to think is not a very good one, but that's just my personal opinion. But lousy. And in Sweden, of course, we have wonderfully done lots of experiments around the world. I'm delighted we experiment with people's lives. I mean, as an experimental scientist, that's wonderful, but we have not done particularly well on the curve.
I'll go first, which is just to say, first of all, this might surprise people. I would give the Trump administration an A in drug development, in that this is the single most impressive thing that the Trump administration achieved. This is like an amazing speed. Realize that you have no idea how well we did on these vaccines. We were prepared to accept a vaccine that had 50% efficacy initially. These vaccines had 95% efficacy. These vaccines broke every record in establishing them. And these vaccines are absolutely amazing. So on that, an A. Rollout at the rest of the Trump administration, C+, maybe a gentleman's B- here in terms of our initial ways of rolling it out. I think we were not prepared. Now here, and again, this is my take on it, part of the problem is actually the federalism of it all, that I think the ways in which we separated the rollout between federal authorities and state authorities led to huge amounts of confusions and difficulties in implementation. I think, starting in January, much better, and then now getting worse a little again. That's what would be my ratings. I'm curious, what do you think?
So as the non-academic on the panel, I'm reticent to give letter grades, but as the practicing lawyer, I will answer with it depends. If we're talking about the vaccine development, I mean, I tend to agree with you. I think the government deserves high marks primarily because it mostly got out of the way. I think, the testing, it's terrible, right? I mean, I actually would disagree on the federalism. I think that the states needed more authority to be able to act and respond to what was going on in the various localities. I think they have more authority. I think they needed more authority. I think when we look at the way some state governments behaved, though, I would give them quite high marks, because I think we saw something really remarkable. One of the sort of silver linings of COVID is this is one of the worst health crises that the United States has seen in some time, and yet all of these regulations that exist on the state level that were justified, as government is supposed to justify regulations on the basis of health and safety, were miraculously not needed, or were actually even standing in the way of public health and safety. And so we got rid of things like restrictions on telemedicine, right? People being able to consult with doctors without actually being there in person, restrictions on licensure that made it hard for medical professionals to move from state to state. And as we scaled these things back, I mean, even silly things like, restrictions on whether or not restaurants can offer carry-out alcohol. And we scale all of these things back, and then we realize, gosh, this was actually better for our public health and safety, and we probably can just make these reforms permanent. So on the state level, I think many states did quite well. I think the feds, it's a mixed bag.
On that point, do you believe that, given our experience with the rapid approval of the vaccines, that this will be the future in terms of government approving? And also, I will say, if folks here have any questions for the panelists, you can start lining up, and we can field some questions as well.
Well, I am optimistic that, given the right to try movement, starting with, of course, the AIDS crisis back in the 80s, right to try movement, COVID now, I'm optimistic that more people are paying closer attention to these types of regulations. I see more patient advocates than ever paying attention and demanding smarter regulations that get access to patients quicker. So I think there's going to be, I think it's impossible to go back to the way things were. I think there's going to be a demand for a change. Now, the question is, we're in Washington, D.C. right now where good ideas go to die. So, how quickly are they going to implement those ideas? I don't know. But I do think that we're going to see a lot more movement on the grassroots level. That's how Right to Try got where it did as quickly as possible. And by the way, Right to Try was not the be-all and end-all. It was just the start, I think, of a lot of this. But that's because it really was a grassroots movement that started in the states. You had almost every single state in a short 5 years passing these laws saying that patients have a right to try these unapproved medications, and Congress could no longer turn a blind eye. And I think we're going to continue to see that type of advocacy, hopefully driving some change in the future.
Yeah, my comment would be that I think that COVID is a wake-up call. It's an example that the anti-science or the lack of availability of actual science to public policymakers in the area of climate change is going to be a far more expensive and ultimately far more damaging than it has been in COVID.
I'll waive my answer. I'd rather hear from the questioners.
Okay. I found interesting the discussion of how we would have done without the FDA and the CDC. I wonder if we could change the hypothetical just a little bit and say, what if we deliberately privatize the function of the FDA to something like, for example, underwriters' laboratories for electronic devices? Private entities could potentially fill the gap and offer private certifications of medicines and things of that nature. Would we have been better off through the crisis had we taken steps to privatize those functions before the pandemic?
Yes.
So I'll say that the move towards the privatization and the information generation function of FDA, that my own view is it's lumpy across what FDA does. If you look at the device space, for example, much of that already exists. The e-health space, much of it already exists. I guess the question I have is, would you, sir, be willing to have taken a vaccine had it been generated by 7 different reports from 7 different private ISOs and the like? My own sense is there is something about the public review and the transparency of that strikes me as particularly important in the vaccination space that may not be adequately occupied by private organizations and the like, at least as to vaccines.
Well, I'd love to answer that question really quickly. Yeah, personally, I think they destroyed public trust in the vaccines by censoring and suppressing science and information, by damaging the integrity of science through the whole process. I think if we'd been without the politicization of the science, I would have been much more readily accepting of vaccines myself. But I don't know how many people would agree with me on that.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to measure that, of course, but I tend to agree with that because, gosh, we all have anecdotal evidence of that, of conversations we've had with people who, seem unusually reticent to take this vaccine given, maybe the likelihood that they would take other vaccines. And I think it really does come down to just a real public distrust in government, which I think generally is a healthy thing, but I think could probably be avoided when you have independent reviews of these sorts of things. And we see that, by the way, right? Look at all of the things that are not regulated by the FDA, that fall completely outside of its regulation, nutritional supplements and things like that. A lot of these things are totally unproven and tested, frankly, because we have the FDA system, and if they don't have to go through it, well, then, they don't. Whereas if we had a privatized system, I think people would pay a lot more attention to those sorts of things, and people do pay attention. There's a lot of nutritional supplements that have a stamp of approval from, a third-party private organization that will go in and do independent testing and say, hey, the ingredients that this company says are there are actually there. And personally, I pay a lot of attention to that, and that's true of everything that we do. From the types of restaurants that we go to, when you go to book a hotel, people look at reviews, they look at independent assessments. So I think there's no reason for us to think that healthcare is or should be any different.
The hotel analogy, let's just press on this for a second, right? Ouchie, ouchie, I took that vaccine, it made my tummy hurt and gave me chills. I shouldn't take it. But I felt really good after I took it. You know, I felt like I was ready to conquer the world, and I'm definitely safe. So please let me into this space, or let me perform surgery, let me go without a mask. I think that that's not the kind of information we need when we're talking about vaccination and drugs and the like.
But I don't want your point to get lost. Nothing corrupts the public perception of science than the impression that a committee, nay, a government committee, is standing between you and the primary scientists. NASA, there was a discovery of phosphine, not important, 3 atoms of hydrogen, 1 phosphine, in the atmosphere of Venus, and someone argued that this was a signature of life on Venus. What did NASA do? They established a committee to make sure that unauthorized, non-consensus claims of life detection would never occur again. That corrupts the public perception of science.
We'll now alternate here, and we'll go to the back row to the gentleman next to Bob Euchre over there.
Hi, my name is Ethan Yang. I'm a 1L at Scalia Law School. I'm also with the American Institute for Economic Research. My question is on the use of unsettled or clearly politicized science when it comes to arguing for the rational basis test when it comes to the state's use of the police power. I think one emblematic example would be Catholic Diocese versus New York, where Justice Gorsuch, writing for the majority, basically ruled that then Governor Cuomo's lockdown policies were very arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. But then in dissent, Justice Sotomayor said Justice Gorsuch doesn't even begin to consider the consensus of her public health experts. Right. So I was just wondering, in the case of clearly politicized science, and obviously this will continue when it comes to climate change, what have you, how should the legal profession really approach science when it comes to justifying things on the grounds of rational basis?
You tell me.
Well, I think you've pointed out one of the problems with the rational basis test, right? And again, when we have one of the myriad problems, but when we have a system that tries to determine, well, first of all, as we know in rational basis tests, there doesn't have to be any basis, and the way we achieve that doesn't have to be rational. But rational basis tests correctly applied by courts, at the end of the day, then you get a battle of experts, and we've discussed, how you can come to multiple different conclusions, and that's why, again, I think in the case of the law, that shouldn't be the starting point. Shouldn't be okay. Well, is this based in expertise, and which expert is right? Again, we've got to look at the principle of autonomy, the principles of freedom, people's individual rights. And this, by the way, is is also a problem with bifurcating rights, because we've touched on this just a little bit, where you have a situation where a mandate might be legal because we say that it supports health and safety, but then there's an exemption for somebody based on their religious views. And it seems kind of bizarre in some ways. If this is necessary for public health and safety, then why do we allow some people to be exempt simply because they follow the right kind of philosophy or the right kind of religion? And I think this is the problem with treating different rights differently. We have a higher standard for free speech and religious freedom, which is why people try to couch things in terms of that, versus when it comes to my own right to medical autonomy or economic freedom or property rights, there's a lower standard, and frankly, they should all rights should enjoy the same protections as free speech rights and religious rights.
Agencies than Mr. Yang's on the rational basis test, because perhaps there should be a higher test than rational basis when you're actually going to physically invade someone. But my question, I'd really like Judge Lee's view of it, but I know he's the moderator, and that's this.
And a judge, so he may not be able to answer for that reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to be clear.
But in civil litigation, we've worked on Daubert for ages. Like, everyone's got to be all the judges have to be a gatekeeper on Daubert. Well, how come when the administrative agencies have one little, Kentucky study on vaccines or something that no scientist thinks is any good, because of the deference we give to the agencies, that's okay, the plaintiffs lose. But if we actually took all of what you're saying about good science and bad science, we'd apply the Daubert test to the administrative agencies, and perhaps we'd get better results. What do you think of that?
Yes.
Yes?
To me, it's a question of epistemology and a question about decision makers and who is in a good epistemic position and a different epistemic position, which is just to say, with all due respect to my friend over here who began the panel by telling him, if you were in the science meeting, you may be in the wrong room. We do not appoint judges in particular to the district courts or to the circuit courts because of their ability to review this kind of evidence. In an ideal world, we do appoint people to the agencies to do so. You may think the agency appointment system is broken. You may think the deference to agencies is broken. But it is the case that we believe the people who make decisions in agency are in a privileged epistemic position as against the district court judges. And that's what justifies a different attitude towards the two.
Go back there.
Hi, question. So in the Cruzon case, in Scalia's consent, he said of the whole topic, he said the courts have no business being involved here. Like second sentence of his opinion, saying that in the ideas of medicine and what happens between a doctor and a patient, that the courts, we don't have a space here, so I don't understand why we're here to begin with. So taking that kind of idea in mind kind of goes to the libertarian vibe that everybody's tossing around. With that, looking from the perspective as a physician, I've always thought that there's almost like an odd physician First Amendment. Like a physician has to have their patient hear the heartbeat. The physician can't just prescribe anything off the cuff to their patient. The physician can't just give cannabis or psilocybin or something that might be more effective. And so there's sort of this limitation by law made by people who don't practice medicine, restricting the physician's practice of medicine. You know, with the 6-week ban right now, no doctor can perform an abortion. That was made by someone who was not an OBGYN in any way, shape, or form. Isn't that, in a way, an unauthorized practice of medicine, or in another sense, at least, the curtailing of the speech of the physician?
I mean, again, you're playing my tune, so I'm going to sing a few more bars about it, which is just to say, this is why in the Docs v. Glocks litigation about whether physicians are allowed to talk to patients, this is why in the debates about being required to show a fetal ultrasound to a patient, libertarians who defend the freedom of information, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of physicians should be up in arms. Now, all that said, and this returns to something that my learned friend over here began the panel with, I do think it's important to realize that there is no way to go from is to ought, as J.L. Mackie said. Science generates for us the information that generates to us policy decisions. But it is if X is true, then because of this reason, Y. Science can give us the is X true or not. But in terms of the arguments about what matters, what has value in the world, whether fetuses are persons or not, those are not questions science can answer because they are not scientific questions. They are moral, normative, and political questions, and therefore the correct place to decide them are moral, normative, and political places.
But Glenn, sciences are no longer giving you the facts.
Good afternoon. My name is Nick DiBenedetto from the New Jersey Lawyers Chapter. My question is specifically for Mr. Benner. Can you talk about, from your perspective, what needs to happen within the scientific community to reduce the reticence to speak and to share the conflicting data? One, coming out of law school just recently, might naively think that the hard sciences and your very data-driven approach would make you guys a little bit more immune to this sort of thing, rather than equally susceptible to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just 4 years ago on a panel over at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni where my panelist was Allison Stanger, who had invited Charles Murray to speak at Middlebury and was rewarded by being sent to the hospital by a concussion from the violent protesters who did not want to study child psychology. There are different, and she turned to us and said, yes, we are expecting STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, to lead us out of the wilderness in this area of political suppression of political ideas. And of course, in the area of child developmental psychology, that ship has sailed. In the area of climate, that ship has sailed. You cannot get grants, tenure, or promotion if you say, for example, that the global warming that so concerns us began in 1750 and was 2/3 over before carbon dioxide became a factor. And we know that because Judith Curry at Georgia Tech said that, and she was forced out of her position at Georgia Tech by Kim Cobb and various other people who subscribed to the science is settled, denier. These are two phrases that were introduced by Al Gore that basically destroy climate science. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I do think that COVID is a sufficiently flexible field right now that you can still find people in academic areas who do not get concerned about losing tenure or losing promotions or grants by making accurate statements. But I think that in child psychology, in particular climate science as well, that ship has sailed.
Judge, if I may petition the court, it looks like we have a question way in the back of the room that I think we might have been missing that third microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jack Etheridge from Ohio. And in August of this year, City Journal published an article called Do Masks Work by Jeffrey Anderson. And in the article, he concludes that 14 of the randomized clinical trials that had been done that tested the effectiveness of masks in preventing the transmission of respiratory viruses, only 3 suggested but did not prove statistically significant evidence and intention to treat analysis that masks might be useful. He went on to say that the other 11 suggested that masks are either useless, whether compared to no mask or because they appear not to add to good hand hygiene, or actually counterproductive. I'm not an anti-mask person. In fact, I love my commemorative Federalist Society mask. But my question is this. Given these conclusions, which seem to be pretty valid scientific conclusions, why is it that mask use is so much focused upon by governments and regulatory agencies?
Okay. So you want to take, Glenn and I have had a back and forth on this. So do you buckle your seatbelt when you get on an airplane? And if you do, who do you think you're fooling? Now, there is, of course, right? There is an energy that below which is put into the airplane, the seatbelt has no effect, and there is an energy above which, if you put it in the airplane, the seatbelt has no effect. But there is actually an energy that goes into the airplane, turbulence, something where the seatbelt is useful, and that's why you do it, because there's basically low cost. There have been studies, there's one in Bangladesh, there's one very well often studied in Denmark, which show 0 to 18% some low effectiveness of masks. My reason why I think a mask is a good idea is because it gives you the impression, just like when you buckle your seatbelt in an airplane, that you're doing something, that you have some degree of control over your fate. And that has psychological value, which is not to be minimized.
I think we'll go into the middle row over there.
I just wanted to ask, do you note the major change that's occurred here with the CDC and the FDA overriding clinicians? This is brand new territory, and it's of great importance to me in 2 areas, not only overriding the clinicians. My daughter had COVID early enough before they even had testing to know what it was. So the doctor sent her home with what he would normally have sent her home with, which was prednisone and a Z-Pak. And this actually saved her life as she was going MIS. If he had followed the current FDA guidelines, he would have sent her home and said for me to bring her back to the hospital when her lips turned blue. And furthermore, with the CDC focusing on useless things like masks, because COVID is 0.15 microns to 0.6 microns. Unless you have an N95 on, your mask is doing nothing. With them focusing on masks and vaccines, which I think the jury is quite frankly still out on, they have ignored things like UV lights and MERV-13 filters. And I spoke with somebody from the Army who said to me, oh yes, upper UV lights work fabulously, but we gave them up once the vaccine came into play. So should this vaccine fail, we don't have UV lights where they deserve to be, and we have clinicians who are afraid to prescribe things such as ivermectin, a $6 pill that they use quite effectively in India, but yet they were looking to grant approval to Pfizer's $700 protease, very cleverly designed around the ivermectin generic drug. So But the big question is we have overridden clinicians and scared our scientists.
So, ma'am, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you on a couple of points and agree with you on one point. The point I'm going to agree with you on is that it's incredibly important that the interventions we've come up with that have helped with COVID be available to everybody, not just in the United States, but across the world, because a life lost anywhere in the world is a tragedy. And how we price drugs and how we think about pricing it, there I agree with you that a $700 pill is a problem if people can't afford it. Where I'm respectfully going to disagree with you is I think the evidence on the efficacy of the vaccines, if you look at our data, you look at the clinical trial data, you look at the data about clinicians in real-world evidence trials, if you look at the data in Israel, you look at the data in the UK, I think it is beyond peradventure that these vaccines are highly safe and highly effective, and they have done a remarkable job. And one, again, that I think is unbelievable how good they are compared to what we would have accepted.
Yeah, let me just.
I do agree with you.
That's pretty much accurate with respect to the vaccines. I've interviewed maybe 200 patient families and coronavirus just to try to get details, and there's no question that if you're above a certain age, not taking a vaccine is probably an extremely bad idea.
I think that just the one thing to add to that, though, is a good point you made is it relates to the seen versus the unseen, or what happens when government makes certain choices. What is it crowding out by not making others? And so I think that is one of the reasons why. Our extremely cumbersome, expensive, lengthy regulatory process not only adds to the costs ultimately of treatments, but of course, when you approve something and don't approve something else, or when something, when a drug company enjoys IP protection before, generics can come on board, it's just something to think about that, what kinds of costs are you adding, both in terms of financial costs and in focusing resources in certain areas versus others. And that's without making a comment about the particular things that you spoke to, but that is a very real concern that I think a lot of people don't think about, because we will never know the things that were not made available to us, or the resources that were not dedicated to things that could have been helpful simply by virtue of the fact that the government didn't choose them.
Gentleman here.
Michael Buschbacher from Boyd & Gray & Associates. One of the hats I wear is an environmental lawyer, and I've worked both for the government at DOJ and in private practice. And one of the very frustrating things, especially working for a lot of fossil fuel companies in private practice and looking at the public policy decisions we're making, is exactly as Professor Benner points out, that just the sheer nonsense that passes for our conversation about climate and pollution. And I wonder, what's the way that we who work in that area might help to restore the covenant that you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks? Because I'm very afraid, for exactly what you mentioned, that we're going to end up in a situation where things are really, really terrible, and unless you're Elon Musk, perhaps. And what are the things that those of us who are not scientists can do to help change the way the conversation goes?
Well, I wish I knew, and I wish you guys as members of the political legal community would advise us on this. What is the case right now is that the scientists are themselves self-enforcing the flow of information outside. So if you ask, when I say anybody who has a reason to know, it's like Christopher Columbus. No, everybody didn't think the world was flat, and Christopher knew it was round. If you asked a farmer, was the world round or flat, they would say, I've never thought about the subject. Likewise, if I were to say to you, was it in fact 9 degrees centigrade warmer, 15 degrees warmer 50 million years ago in the Eocene, you would say, I've never thought about it. But that's a fact. It's widely known. Everybody knows it. Everybody also knows that since the last ice age, we're somewhere in the 70th percentile. That is, 30% of the years have been warmer and 70% of the years have been cooler. So, and the coral reefs have done fine. The polar bears did fine. There was not, right? All of this is well known to people in geology departments, but you are not permitted to say it. And if you say it, you will not get a grant, you will not get promoted, you will not get tenure, you won't get a job. Now, how you manage that is beyond me, because remember, the seeds of this were sown 20 years ago when the science was determined to be settled by the political authorities. Very Lysenko is a very good model for that, actually. And then if you were not agreement, you were a science denier. And of course, what a science denier is a scientist, right? It's somebody who challenges, right? Now, I don't know how you handle this, right? As I said to the previous questioner, this ship has sailed, right? It's not, climate science is like genetics in the Soviet Union. It took generations for that to work itself out of the system. And and the fact that you have Boris Johnson, who's a conservative party from the UK, Aaron O'Toole in Canada, this is not a left-right thing any longer. This is a university consensus based on no science at all. And I don't know how you handle it at this point because, as I say, Judith Curry is thrown out for saying true statements. When you say true statements and you're thrown out of the academic life, that's quite a tragedy for people in academic life because we don't know how to get a real job.
But it's even more than that, right? In addition to the self-censoring scientists and things like that, I mean, this is another area where we have positive and normative statements, and people fail to distinguish between the two when they make policies. And it is just simply not the case that there are people out there that believe we should have a pollution-free environment. No human being that wants to live wants a pollution-free environment, right? No human being that wants to live comfortably. And so, the question comes down to, I mean, even if we can come to a consensus on climate change and what's causing it and what the trajectory is, then the question becomes one of, so what, right? So then what do we do about it? And again, do we use this scalpel or sledgehammer approach? Do we say, well, we can go ahead and give our lives back to the earth and stop doing whatever it is that we're doing, and then we will all perish. We will not have vaccines and things like that. Or, do we say, okay, well, let's think about the consequences of human decisions and how much pollution or how much effect on the environment, to the extent that we have those effects, is acceptable to live the type of life we want to live. And again, that goes back to everybody has different view on that. Everybody has different assessments. So that's what makes it so hard for a regulator to just come in and say, well, I'm following the science, and gosh, we have climate change, and so now we've got to stop all pollution. We've got to stop all business. We've got to move everybody to electric cars, and hold our breath really long.
I mean, I would love it if we had a regulator that said we want to take those steps, right? We can't even get them to take baby steps. We're not talking about ending all pollution and ending all business, just to be clear here, right? The most optimistic kinds of activities we're talking about are nowhere near that. And I do think it is a question, as you say, of the scalpel of how much. That is an inherently normative question. And the question is, do you love your grandkids? Do you love your great-grandkids? Do you love your great-great-grandkids? And how far does your love extend versus your desire to live the life you live right now? And that is an inherently normative question, but one we should all be asking ourselves.
But the scientists are not providing you the grounds to form that answer.
Completely agree.
Sure.
We'll go in the back there.
Yes, thank you. My name is Paul Kamenar. I'm a lawyer here in Washington, D.C. I have two questions. One, both Professor Cohen and Ms. Sandiford correctly said that the FDA cannot ban the off-label use of FDA-approved drugs. But in terms of promotion, 9 years ago, the Second Circuit held in U.S. versus Coronia, quote, the government cannot prosecute pharmaceutical manufacturers and their representatives under the FDCA for speech promoting the lawful off-label use of an FDA-approved drug. So my first question is, isn't the FDA following the circuit rule on this and other circuits?
No.
They're not following it. Okay, they're a lawless agency, so there we go. Second question is, and we're talking about masks, and nothing personal, Professor Cohen, but we all see that you are wearing a mask, and as a matter of science, would you agree that the only way that you can affect Ms. Sandiford is if you're infected and droplets are going into her airways and vice versa? You cannot be infected unless she is and droplets going into your airways. And so I'm going to ask you the Aaron Rodgers question. What is your vaccination status?
What, we're going to get into HIPAA violations now? No, I'm just teasing. That's what we call trolling where I'm from, right? So when you've been trolled, you troll back. That's how they teach us to operate. The truth of the matter is, right, I'm kind of surprised when I look out at this audience of people who I think of as intelligent, people who I think of as well-educated, and the like. While we may have differences about the level of efficacy of masks, I am surprised that more people in this audience don't think they want to. It's not comfortable, don't get me wrong, but haven't made the personal choice. Forget about mandates and forget about DC about this. Maybe we just have different risk assumptiveness or risk aversion amongst us.
But that does kind of go back to how people perceive information, right? I think it's just an interesting sort of sociological experiment to be in different geographic areas where there may be mandates and still see, wide number of people just not wearing masks anymore. And then I've actually been in areas where there are not mandates, and I've seen quite a few people wearing masks. So, that kind of goes back to especially for, I think, the bulk of the people who are in this room that just have, and again, an admirable in most cases, just sort of knee-jerk reaction to, I don't want to be told what to do by the government. Are these mandates actually counterproductive, and do they get people, do they further erode the trust between, scientists or regulators and the general population?
Let me point out, though, COVID could be different, right? This is likely an engineered virus, which may be one of the reasons why it presents to the public so crazy that we've never seen the symptomatic distribution. But had COVID been like, diphtheria, whooping pox, and any of a number of other things, we would not be wearing masks as a preventative. That we just couldn't tolerate that, right? So if COVID were different, a mask would not be sufficient. And of course, then we would be, it's an interesting question as to how the modern public would require or adapt to an influenza from like 1918. It's a very interesting question as to what we would do as a regulatory legal status if we actually had a really serious pandemic.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. My name's Elizabeth. I'm a fourth-year evening student at Georgetown Law School. I think most of us in this room who are lawyers and right-of-center lawyers came into COVID with already formed opinions about the administrative state and about, liberty interests and all of those things. But I think the average American soured on government science over time. I don't think they came in with that prior opinion. And I think in large part they soured because of this sense that either the scientists are just making it up or they're not being honest with us. Dr. Fauci says you don't have to wear masks, then he says you do have to wear a mask. Then they say vaccinated people don't have to wear masks, and they say vaccinated people do have to wear masks, and they say, COVID doesn't spread in aerosol, and now it does, and COVID, vaccinated people can't get COVID and end up in the hospital. It has a 99% of efficacy. Oh, maybe it's not. Maybe it fades over time. I understand some of this is an aspect of science, right? Science develops over time, as well as science isn't always 100% certain. So why do our government scientists not do a better job of communicating this to the American people? Because in some ways, I think the lack of trust that Americans now have in science is due to the very scientists' own fault in not communicating what they themselves truly believe about these things, which is it's not certain. So what would your advice be to government scientists about how to communicate with the American people, and why do you think they have this hesitancy to express the uncertainty that is inherent in scientific inquiry?
So I completely agree with you that we'd be better off if we were more open with people about the scientific process and about the inherent uncertainty involved with it, especially sciences like epidemiology, and especially trying to do this in real time and making real decisions. As to the reluctance to kind of embrace that, I do think there's an interesting question about the weaponization of kind of doubt in this space, and whether we're in a space where actually as a government regulator to express doubt or uncertainty or openness about the process, whether the fear is that that's going to be used in such a way that it'll produce a result that's counterproductive. That doesn't mean you shouldn't still do it. But when I look at, for example, the early interviews of Rochelle Walensky, the first few where she was pilloried by the American nations, where she was the most uncertain and the most, I think, kind of unwilling to take strong positions. And my own view is that We have a very difficult time in this country understanding how science occurs. That's a failure, I think, in some ways of our education system. And this has been an up-close, microscopic look at the development of scientific questions in real time. And I think most people just were not ready for it, and that's what's led to a lot of the confusion and a lot of the problems.
Are you familiar with the male answer syndrome? My wife tells me that if you ask a man a question and he does not know the answer, he'll give you an answer anyhow. Scientists need to say more frequently the four most important words, I do not know, and that's something that scientists say. But I do agree with Glenn that we have been remiss in our education system in explaining what science is, which is centered around uncertainty. And as Feynman says, science begins with a disbelief in experts. But you also have a political process now, which goes back, and Al Gore is largely responsible for it in the area of climate, where we do not express the fact that science begins with a distrust of experts, and the statement, trust the experts, is anti-science.
In the back there.
Well. Okay. Hi, Lee Otis with the Federalist Society. So I have a question for Mr. Cohen, for Professor Cohen. Basically, it's kind of if your argument about the FDA and the CDC is a placebo effect argument, or if it's this tells us that they're right argument. When you say that. Do you feel better taking a vaccine because when they've approved it? Are you really making a case that it makes us feel better? Kind of like Mr. Benner was arguing about the seatbelts in the airplanes, or are you arguing that our intuition about this sort of tells us something about whether they're right or wrong?
So it's not a question about intuition here, so I think maybe none of the above would be the answer I'd give if you don't mind. And so here's my answer, which is just to say, if you wanted to look at data set that had been poured over probably by more people than any other biomedical data set in the history of modern medicine, it is the data set as to the efficacy of the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, the J&J vaccine across the world. And there's a reason why I trust it, whereas if you offered me the choice between that and the Sino vaccine or the Russian vaccine, I would much prefer these. And that is because FDA pre-specified the standards by which it would review these, engaged in a method, expert panels having received it in a transparent way, data has been published, and we can look at that. And we can look at it, we can have disagreements, but I can see all of this. When you give a private organization the right to make these kinds of calls and generate the information, if I trust that private information, that private organization, it may be good, it may be bad, but it will not nearly have the level of transparency and the level of accountability of the FDA. I don't get to punish the CEO of that private organization the way I get to punish the president at the ballot box if it turns out their FDA is insufficient.
And I'm going to have to push back a little bit on that. As somebody who has filed freedom of information requests through my organization with the FDA and waited literally 5 years to get simple responses from the FDA after the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals had to multiple times tell the FDA to turn that information over to us. I don't think the FDA is a transparent organization at all. And furthermore, I think that the FDA feels basically no consequence when it fails to do its job correctly, because it can just turn around and go to Congress and say, well, the reason we weren't able to get these drugs approved quickly is because we don't have enough resources, give us more money. What business, what private business gets to come to the general public and say, hey, I failed, I might have even put lives at risk or killed people, keep giving me your business? Just doesn't happen. So frankly, I think the idea that the FDA is somehow more transparent than private businesses, the idea that regulators at the FDA, even if we assume they have everyone's best intentions, at heart, which I do believe most of them do, that they don't have their own individual biases, their own individual politics or preferences. It's just that's not how human nature works. The difference is that we have competition in one system and we have lack of transparency and entrenched bureaucracy in the other. And I will trust my life to the former.
I'm very inclined to be satisfied with Airbnb, which is whether I should stay somewhere, but not Airbnb when it's a question about whether I should take a drug that might lengthen my life or endanger my life. And I think that's just a fundamental difference between the two of us.
But Christina just tells you the FDA did not respond to this is our experience as well, for 5 years. It's not a transparent organization, Glenn.
To be clear, what I said was the data set generated here was the most transparent, the most pored over. I agree with you that the FDA is not as transparent as it should be. The big obstacles, though, have to do a lot more with trade secrecy and the corporations and the pharmaceuticals than they do necessarily with the FDA.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Powell. I work for Harvard's Office of Technology Development. I have more of a philosophical question for Professor Cohen and Ms. Sandifer. As libertarians, or from a libertarian perspective, where do you each draw the line between personal autonomy, individual rights, and any obligation we may have to protect our fellow citizens and others?
Yeah, I mean, that is not only a question, it's the question, right? Typically when it comes to these decisions, I do think that I'm a libertarian and not an anarchist, because I do believe that there is a very limited role for government in protecting people's rights. And so I do think that the closer you get to things like vaccinations or other public safety measures, there's arguably some role for government simply because you are talking about people's decisions that have an effect on others. So where exactly you draw that line, I think I'll borrow the phrase that more people need to be comfortable saying, and that is, I don't know. But what I do know is that we are nowhere near that line. And we've been talking about getting rid of the FDA and the CDC. I wish we were at a point where that was the next question. What we have is a system that defers to government over individual autonomy, and almost every time this question comes up. So my feeling is that when there is a tie or a close call, the true libertarian response has to be to defer to the individual's decision, the individual autonomy. But so many times we don't even have those close calls, and we still have our finger on the scale for the government.
Do I have time to answer, or you tell me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, quick answer. First of all, not a card-carrying libertarian. I was careful to say that at the beginning, an outsider, right? But here's what I'll say. The question about mandating vaccines, this is essentially the conversation we should be having. What am I allowed to ask of people in order to reduce the risks of people who are immunosuppressed, people who are sensitive, and people in general who have children and the like? And if our political discourse could be about that question, questions about what easy sacrifice is and hard sacrifice, and what we're allowed to ask, our political discourse would be all the better for it.
Thank you.
I know you were standing there for a while. It has to be very quick. It could be last question.
It's a very quick question. Some of the panelists and questioners have privileged the physician-patient relationship, but physicians do derive part of their authority from state licensing regimes, and I'm curious how these arguments that we've been talking about interact with that. We've talked a lot about federal regulation. Thank you.
Is your questions about the state licensure? And well, I mean, I guess I would just say that it is true that states have an enormous power, breathtaking power over a physician's ability to be able to practice his or her profession. And I think that more conversation has to be devoted to that as well, because frankly, physicians may be free to take certain steps, but if they do so, their medical licenses can be in jeopardy. And that's another way, as you rightly pointed out, that the physician-patient relationship is harmed.
This gentleman happens to be one of my former students, so it's not a ringer, but I know that you, sir, are an MD. And one of the things that's very interesting is if you go through the history of the practice of medicine back to 1700 or so, you'll find that DOs and MDs, which are the two people whom we call medical doctors right now, were not the only claimants to that title, that actually the history of medicine is a weeding out of various sub-schools. And if you find this interesting, again, I highly recommend Louis Grossman's new book on freedom of therapeutic choice, which begins around that era.
Okay. And before we conclude, I want to remind everyone to stay here in this room. We will have the Bork Memorial Lecture featuring the Honorable Lawrence Silberman. But I want to thank all the panelists here for their wonderful discussion today.